Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this program by Radboud Reflects and the Radboud Institute for Science in Society on statistics. Thank you all for being here. Good of you to come. Statistics, numbers and figures, they are everywhere around us, in politics, in media, in discussions in general. But always taking statistics at face value can be quite difficult and also quite confusing. For example, what if I were to tell you that there is a population of people in a certain area that has been increased by 400%? You might be thinking, wow, 400%, that sounds quite drastic. What happened there? Then again, later this evening, I will be inviting my 3 guests to join me on stage. And by doing so, I will be increasing the number of people on stage by 400%. So context does matter. Tonight, we'll be taking a closer look at how statistics work and how we use them in politics, in policy, in the way we communicate. First, we'll be listening to a lecture by scholar of organization Alan Irwin. He is professor at the Institute for Organization at the Copenhagen Business School. And he is interested in the relationship between the public and science. And currently he works on innovation and research policy. After his lecture, I will be having a discussion with him and with our 2 other guests, Noelle Aerts and Sijbrand de Jong. Noelle is a professor of ecological, this is a difficult word, I always forget that one, socio-ecological interactions, that's the one, at Radboud University. And she studies how people communicate with each other and how that can create space to create sustainable change. And last but not least, Sijbrand de Jong. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Science here at the Radboud University. And he is an expert, there are so many difficult words here, you guys. He is an expert on elementary particle and astroparticle physics there. At the end of the discussion, of course, as always, there will be time for some of you to ask a question. So save them for the end of the event. My name is Pam Teunissen. I am a program developer at Radboud Reflects, and I'll be acting as a moderator during the discussion. Okay, I think that's it for me. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Irwin.
Thank you very much, Pam, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm sure there's plenty of things going on in the world on a Thursday evening, but it's so impressive that so many of you come out for this event. There's a brilliant panel. We had a little pre-discussion a couple of days ago, and Pam was kind of trying to quieten us down at some point because there's a worry that we might have peaked too soon. But I think I can promise a lively discussion, and I know many friends and colleagues and distinguished visitors are in the room, so I'm really looking forward to this as a discussion. And, well, what am I going to do? There's the title, but basically I want to do 3 things, very simple. I have 25 minutes, and I'm rather confident that Pam will keep me to 25 minutes. I'm going to tell 2 stories, basically about heated areas of policy debate, one going back in time, one coming a little bit closer. I'm going to just explore or possibly just raise some of the questions that come up in practice. I have a feeling that the questions and issues will jump out as I'm talking because there seems to be so much to discuss in this area. And I'm going to argue, strangely perhaps, about something about the relationship between evidence, including statistical evidence, and democracy. Now, how do those 2 things fit together? That's what I hope we can explore. But I'm going to start, as I said, by going back in time, all the way actually to 1980. So hardly anyone in the room was born at that time. Well, hardly anyone was born in the room at that time, but I was. And so back at that time, I was interviewing people around a particular dispute. And I wanted to take a historical example. That might seem odd, because I'm not really into the rights and wrongs of this particular case. I'm hoping over 40 years later, those kind of questions can be put to rest. But I do want to talk about some of the questions and some of the issues that arose in that context. And I want to use that, my first story, is a way of asking some questions, particularly as Pam was suggesting, about the relationship between evidence and public groups. So what was going on in 1980? What is it that I want to go back to? Well, a pesticide called 2,4,5-T, and don't worry about the name of it. Some of you will know this name, some of you probably don't. Let's just call it a pesticide. Or actually, it was a herbicide. So it was a defoliant that was used to clear, for example, agricultural or parkland. And this became controversial for a number of reasons. One of them was because of its connection to Agent Orange that was used in the Vietnam War. Some of you may be familiar with that story. But also, generally, evidence was coming out, and that's the theme of this evening, linking this particular herbicide or pesticide to a number of, very tragic effects. I'm talking about birth deformities, miscarriage, and various kinds of cancer. So here we have a situation of a group of people, the National Union, I'll just call them the farm workers, who perhaps understandably, well, I would say very understandably, are anxious because evidence is coming out associating this particular herbicide and other ones too, but I'll just stick with this one, to all kinds of health effects. And the story I want to tell basically is about the arguments, and it was quite heated at that point, I can tell you, between the farm workers who were putting this evidence together, obviously concerned about the health and safety of their members, and the advisory committee, which was called the Advisory Committee on Pesticides. That's the UK Advisory Committee on Pesticides. I'll probably just call it the Advisory Committee from here on. So you see articles like this where the unions were pressing for a ban on this particular pesticide. So what was going on in this dispute? What was happening here? Well, if you look at the kind of statement that was coming out of the advisory committee at that point, and let's just take it that these are good scientists, well-trained people. I'm not suggesting any bad intent or anything like that on their part. You can see this phrase comes out. They say, we shall continue to examine any soundly based new evidence. But the key thing is in bold, 2,4,5-T herbicides can safely be used in the recommended way and for the recommended purposes. That was the official advice coming out of that. And you might think, well, that sounds entirely reasonable to say in the recommended way and for the recommended person. And I think the person in the picture is doing that in a very protected kind of fashion. But the farm workers who I was talking to at that point was saying, hey, this is not the reality of how we work. This is not like being in the laboratory. Imagine how it is when you don't even know what you're spraying. You're told there's a can of chemicals here. Will you go and put them over on the second fields along? And what do you do on a hot day? What do you do when you want to go to the loo? What do you do when you want to have your lunch and you're a long way back? These are farm conditions we're talking about, not laboratory conditions. So this phrase, the recommended way and for the recommended purposes, on the one hand, and that's my point, you can see is perfectly logical and indeed reasonable. For the farm workers, it was, well, we're not really satisfied that you are taking account of the conditions in which we live and work. In fact, we think you have a totally unrealistic idea. How did they react to this? Well, back to evidence and statistics again. They compiled what they called a dossier. And this dossier basically consisted of 40 questions. It was distributed in their newspaper. 40 questions, and the kinds of things that were being asked were like this. There was a whole bunch of questions. I've just picked a few out here. Have you ever had any of the following symptoms after using weed killers containing 2,4,5-T? Do you suffer from any of the following? Have you or your partner, you can read it, ever had a spontaneous miscarriage? So what's happening here is people are being asked, on the one hand, have they used this pesticide? And on the other hand, have you had any of these kinds of consequences? And for the union, that then led And so this kind of statement, which is them now talking back to the advisory committee saying, considering the additional evidence, the existence of alternative weed killers, it becomes absolutely incomprehensible that workers, their families, and the general public can remain subject to the risks for 1 minute longer. Actually, not 1 minute longer became the label they used as part of this campaign, not 1 minute longer. The advisory committee, consisting, just to keep the story simple, basically of scientists, looked at this dossier, this evidence from the farm workers, and basically said, this is not science. This is not how you do statistics. It's not surprising that people have birth defects, or have children, with birth defects, or abnormalities. I mean, these tragedies happen all the time. So their response from the Pesticides Committee went like this. The reality is that some women who have been in contact with such an agent are likely to miscarry. That was one of the sources of evidence the farm workers have pointed to, and that some are likely to bear malformed children, but this in itself does not add up to cause and effect. Indeed, statistically, it would be remarkable if families in contact with particular products were spared from these misfortunes. Now, in the real world of the story as it unfolded, I don't know what you're thinking. I saw there was a couple of nods when I said something about causality, and that, of course, is a perfectly valid argument to say, what is the association between being exposed to this particular weed killer or herbicide and consequences? How does that in any way constitute evidence? For the farm workers, of course, it was really about the kind of burden of proof that was required in a case like this. In one heated meeting, I wasn't there, but I heard from both sides about it, the farm workers were basically arguing, we have no faith in you as an advisory committee because we do not feel that you're considering the conditions in which we live. And a person from the advisory committee said, yeah, but if we ban this particular herbicide, you're going to ask us to ban a whole other bunch of herbicides as well. This won't stop. And the farm workers were saying, yes, that's exactly the point. We don't want our members exposed to any level of risk. Now, there's a lot there, and I said it's a story which, to me, the fact that I'm speaking about it all these years later, raises some really troublesome questions, I have to say. And let me just list, not as questions, but some of the points that occur to me from a story like that. One is about the weight of evidence. And I mean, it's quite interesting in that case, going back to the main theme of this lecture, that the farm workers didn't simply say, hey, there's lots of other herbicides out there. We want this banned because we don't see why any level of risk is appropriate. Instead, they went out and compiled a dossier. And whatever you think of this scientifically is a form of evidence. The fact is that evidence was seen to be required by the farm workers. They were trying to come up with something which they thought, and actually they felt very strongly, was convincing because they thought that was the best way they could possibly make their case. So the fact that evidence is used in that way is already interesting. You might say there are other arguments, ethical arguments, for example, that might have been employed. But no, it was evidence that weighed on both sides of this. One point which we might also discuss is about the burden of proof in a case like that. How much evidence is required in order to ban a pesticide? If you say, well, you need convincing 100% proof, well, okay, fine, that's rigorous and clear, but then you're basically waiting to count a lot of bodies, aren't you, before you get that level of proof, to put it simply. So is it about the balance of probabilities? That in general, it's like the chances that it's dangerous are greater than the chances that it's not dangerous, which is a criterion that's often used in civil court cases. If you're trying to sue me for some stupid thing I say in this session, it'll be on a balance of probabilities logic. Did I mean that? Did I have evidence? Or like in a murder trial, should it be proven beyond all reasonable doubt? The union felt that the advisory committee were looking for beyond all reasonable doubt. Their level of evidence was for the farm workers simply unreasonable because of the consequences for their members. There's also, as I stressed in this story, something about and I said this a couple of times, laboratory conditions versus conditions of practice. What happens, and this is familiar, it also came up in arguments about BSE, when people are saying with good intent, well, it's okay for use in the recommended way and for the recommended purposes, when people are saying, but that's not what happens. It isn't used in the recommended way and for the recommended purposes. And you're making assumptions which are simply not doable in practice. Those are not the conditions in which we work, said the farm workers at the time. So how do you deal with that? You could say, as a good colleague, Brian Winnow, has argued, there's a kind of sociology, a very naive sociology going on both sides about what the real conditions are. But it was very difficult in this context to discuss. Clearly, trust comes into this relationship. For the farm workers, reasonable or unreasonable, this led to a huge loss of trust in the advisory committee, reasonable or unreasonable. And as I said already, I think of members of the advisory committee as people doing their very best with all good intentions. But still, in that situation, the farm workers' conclusion was, we need some representative body. We need members inside this committee. We don't want to be outside the committee. Trust seems to be essential. And you might argue that goes both ways as well. I suspect many members of the advisory committee were very frustrated by the campaigning that the farm workers were doing because they felt that they were misrepresenting the evidence. So it goes certainly both ways. And values, I think, I'm not going to stress that, are extremely important. Now, there's a lot of evidence, a lot of discussion about these kind of challenges. So I'm not trying to act like I'm the first person to draw attention to this. I just reference one report because it was an extensive literature review, and you can see it up there, talking about the problems of linking science and policy, particularly, and this is characteristic, looking at questions of complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity, and yes, mistrust. But one thing that often comes out, like in the farm workers' case, is this question of multiple perspectives. And I think, again, that might be something we want to get into a debate about. Is there basically one truth in a story like the one I just told about 245T? Or do we somehow have to weigh up these different ways of understanding? You could say the evidence stays the same, but the ways in which they're interpreted, on the one hand, by the farm workers, on the other hand, by the advisory committee, can be starkly different, leading to actually a very strong breakdown. But before we get into that discussion, I want to use a second case. I won't talk about that so much, but it's connected to citizen science. And this interesting phenomenon, which certainly we weren't talking about in 1980, of people, well, let's keep it simple, doing science for themselves. And many people, probably including me, see this as having huge benefits in terms of democratizing knowledge. Again, we can talk about what we mean by that, by seeing people, in that case, like the farm workers, not simply as the recipients of evidence, but also as creators of evidence. However you evaluate statistically that dossier I was referring to, you have to see that the farm workers were trying in some way, a little bit like science, to systematically compile evidence rather than simply making political or ethical arguments. But this also raises questions about the relationship between evidence and policy. And I'm just going to briefly mention a more recent study. This is in the context of COVID, so not very long ago, and it was led by my colleague Sina Zambak. And Sina and Maya Horst and I have written a paper about this, and the cases of citizen data scientists. So this story is different. It's probably not as polarized as the story I told before, but it's basically about how during COVID, you see groups of people, this was in Denmark, but not only in Denmark, basically starting to, well, not exactly compile statistics for themselves. I think what was happening mainly was that they were re-representing data. So typically, the people we were talking to, these citizen data scientists who often were very sophisticated, I have to say, in terms of their modeling techniques, were taking government evidence and re-representing it in ways because they thought basically the government representatives were doing a poor job of putting the evidence across in accessible ways. So this is also about science communication. And what you see in a case like that, and of course this is very different from the case back in 1980, the use of social media particularly. A lot of this is happening on Twitter, which in Denmark is used actually by a lot of journalists and government officials and academics. So this is now going directly into the public domain through a Twitter account, and representations which some of you might recognize. I saw the one on the bottom right. It's actually hard to know where did they come from. Did they come from citizen groups, this graph where they were trying to level out the impact of COVID in order to allow a sufficient vaccine supply. But that found itself being reproduced all over the place. In other words, blurring the traditional boundaries between the experts over here. I mean, I was doing a bit of that before, wasn't I? The experts on the advisory committee and the farm workers have got the practical experience. Blurring these two things together through social media in a way which, of course, you could say is very appealing, but at the same time raises questions. The kind of thing the citizen data scientists were doing would look like this. So they would be taking statistical evidence and re-representing it in those kind of ways. Two of those examples are from Denmark and one's actually from Sweden. But I won't dwell on what it's doing, but you can see people thinking very creatively about how do we represent these statistics in a way that makes sense or perhaps communicates more clearly, for example, differential risks within society. It was quite hard in Denmark to get data on that. Well, clever people were doing this in a citizen data science fashion rather than as professional scientists. Who did they think they were? What did they think they were doing? Well, we talked a lot to these citizen data scientists and asked them about their motivations, and some of it is up there. I won't read out the quotes, but sometimes people saw themselves as debunking other arguments that they saw in the public debate. They would see people making arguments, and remember these are citizen groups, not researcher groups in that sense, saying, well, some people seem to be getting it wrong. There's a particular think tank with a kind of neoliberal perspective who are arguing for total openness in Denmark. And they were saying, no, the guy was just getting the data all wrong. So I felt it was really important to get out into social media with an account that was much more accurate. Some of them definitely saw themselves as educating, teaching members of the public, but also government officials, some aspects that they might think that they were missing. There was a debate about the risks of certain vaccines in Denmark, and the government decided not to proceed with use of those vaccines. And citizen groups were saying, no, don't do that because it's better for young people to have some protection rather than no protection. And here's some data which backs this up. So better for people to be doing that than waiting for the best vaccine to become available. Some of them talked about anxiety relief. I mean, they were anxious, they were worried, and found that by being involved in presenting this kind of data, it gave them the feeling of empowerment, that it was a way of accessing this. I think something similar was probably happening with the farm workers that I talked about before, that rather than simply doing nothing and getting angry, let's do something, and doing something could mean this. But one big discussion, and I guess that's the main point of the debate this evening, was about policy influence. If you can read that quote from where you're sitting, I think the person behind that quote is very skeptical of the policy influence they had. But they would regularly talk about that, and there would be some difference between the citizen data scientists. Actually, the ministry at one point, after seeing this interview, in fact, with a senior official, went out saying, we thank all the citizen data scientists because you really helped the process. But I know privately, many policymakers found it very difficult. It does raise questions. It raises questions about, how are you supposed to know what's a reliable source of evidence and what isn't a reliable source of evidence? How are government officials, under obviously extreme pressure in this, situation where no one really knew what was going on. How were they supposed to know what was just helpful and what, frankly, they often admitted, the civil servants, could be just frustrating because now the agenda is being driven by a group of citizens or citizen scientists, so to say, rather than by our expert groups. So we have to think about the benefits, but also some of the challenges of the idea that evidence is becoming more, let me call it, democratic, that people can access this information. Actually, one of the things the citizen data scientists did was lobby hard for data to be provided in an accessible fashion so they could do these things, because otherwise they were simply transcribing and trying to work things out. The government did do that in order to allow people to access data. There's clearly a blurred line here between scientific evidence and science communication, but also, as I've tried to suggest, one can see this as a very positive intervention, that people are directly getting involved, in this case, in COVID data and opening that up in often very innovative, very clever ways. And many of the scientists we spoke to and government officials just simply admired it and said, well, we didn't think of it and we didn't have the time in that situation, so it was brilliant to get that kind of support. But at the same point, as we know about discussions of social media, concerns about what does that amount to. Okay, I can see my time is running, Pam. And if this clock is accurate, you say, I was going to say 3, and she held up 2 fingers, so okay. Somewhere between those 2 things. So what am I saying? I'm saying, of course, high-quality evidence is essential to good governance, but that the evidence, as both of those cases suggest, doesn't simply speak for itself. I mean, in the first case, you have these multiple perspectives. What's reasonable to expect? What is the burden of proof that should be applied? How acceptable is any level of risk? Seems bound up with the evidence in ways which might feel uncomfortable, and some of you might well be arguing, let's separate the science from the politics in these things. But in practice, these things get very interlinked. That's in both my stories. So it can be contested, and of course the evidence needs to be judged in context. If you go back to the pesticide or weed killer case, you can see that one obvious question is, what are the alternatives of this weed killer? What's the need that arises? And what other ways have we got of addressing that need? The problem is that the language of statistics doesn't often get us to very helpful answers when it comes to the question of need. But how do you weigh up the evidence unless you've also got a sense of what the need might be? I think as I finish, I would also want to say, it seems to me that we need open reflection upon these issues. I think that's why I wanted to raise the farm workers case again, because it seems that a lot of the issues, and I just called it fake news, that old discussion come about because of precisely a polarization which occurs and an inability when you're locked into a controversy or things are moving very fast, like in the COVID situation, to reflect upon what's happening. I think one of the things the citizen data scientists could do would be to question some of the judgments were being made, for example, about the behavior of young people in Denmark, and say, well, this isn't an evidence statistical thing. This is about, how we're going to look after the welfare of young people. We need to weigh both these things at the same time, and statistics alone won't answer that. And I think I also want to say that values are unavoidably part of these discussions. Both of them, to me, raise value-based questions. You might detect, certainly when I was doing those interviews with the farm workers, because I spoke to them first, I was immediately taken with their view and their frustrations. When I spoke to the advisory committee people, I thought, I could also see their point of view. The value question was, how do you get people together to discuss those things openly? How can you create a spirit of critical reflection, also after COVID, I have to say, in terms of acknowledging that we get things wrong in those situations and that on all sides we need to learn. And I'm going to finish, this is my last thing, just a nod towards climate change, because that's an obvious case and I didn't touch upon it, but it's very interesting to me. This is taken from the IPCC. I always want to call it the Interplanetary Commission. It's the intergovernmental. panel on climate change. This is their most recent report. It's the dissemination part of the report. And I picked out these factors, the conditions that enable and conditions that constrain constructive discussion, because you can see when you look at that, evidence is clearly in there, but a lot of the factors, and I'll just leave it hanging there, are as much about governance, they're as much about values, and they're as much about what kind of democracy we want to create as they are about statistics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a seat.
Yeah, thanks.
Let's see.
Oh.
Put this here.
And my pen would be good.
You can have a seat as well, if you like. Because I don't think this one has the correct time.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry to...
I will make some room. Yes. Well, thank you so much. I have a lot of questions myself, but at first I'm also very curious to hear from you, Noelle and Sijbrand, about what struck you about what we just heard. Maybe I can start with you, Noelle.
Yeah, you can say it's quite shocking stories that you shared with us. From my point of view and from my experience, I recognize a lot. I mean, I'm a communication scientist and I'm studying conversations between people who disagree about these complex societal issues that we are confronted with today, biodiversity laws, climate change, etc., all these things. And in those debates, people use statistics and models and figures and numbers all the time. And, I would consider them as, what they do is putting some aspects of reality, so to speak, to the fore, and at the same time, other aspects, they disappear to the background. And that's what I would define a frame. And what we see in those debates is that these frames, including statistics, numbers, figures, are used to persuade others. They are strategically used, not always consciously, but we select aspects from reality. So that's what I see, and that's what I also recognize, is that you can have statistics, but you have always statistics who prove the contradictory reality, so to speak. So I recognize a lot in your story from my perspective.
People are very selective about the kinds of numbers that work for them and that they then can use to sort of frame the reality in the way that suits their own narrative.
Exactly, and it seems that numbers, figures, statistics, that they are very, very hard facts, but in fact they are as soft as values, maybe, or maybe even much more softer, I would say.
What about you, Sijbrand?
Well, the thing that struck me most, and thank you very much for your lecture, it was very instructive. I must admit that I'm not so shocked by the example because I see so many of them.
Yeah.
But the thing that really struck me was in your conclusion, slide 1, on the top line, you said something like heathy debate. And I was wondering if that was deliberate as a superposition of healthy and heated.
I say that.
The L was missing.
Oh, okay.
So I thought maybe it was by construction.
I'll now pretend it was.
So yeah, that was the sort of the one sort of pinpoint thing that struck me. But then,
But maybe content-wise.
yeah, well, I thought it could have been content. But the content-wise, maybe complementary to what Noelle said. In the first case, it was also a case of failing logic, in my opinion, to not conclusively to have no conclusive evidence that something is there doesn't mean it isn't there. Right? That is in statistics. It's not algebra. Okay? If it's in algebra, you can say, well, if it's not 5, it's not 5. Okay, but in statistics, conclusive evidence that something is not there doesn't mean it's not there. It can also mean that you have lack of statistics or somewhere in a gray zone. So and then of course, once things are in that sense inconclusive, then the emotion comes in. Like, what do you weigh? Is weighing the certainty that there's nothing wrong with using it heavier, or is saving the crop weighing heavier, or the precedence of a conclusion? But first has to come the recognition that an inconclusive study doesn't mean it's not there.
But then again, I wonder, in the example that you used in the beginning about the farmers and the pesticides, we see both sides of the debate invoking statistics to make their case. Instead of, as you mentioned, one of the, for example, the farmers invoking ethical reasons or values or something like that. So what is it about statistics or numbers and figures that attracts us so much that we basically use them as hard facts?
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you sort of think, in the case of the farm workers in the first story, what if there'd been no evidence? What if the dossier said, no, we've had no health problems whatsoever. Actually, there are benefits of being exposed to this herbicide. That would be very difficult to handle in that situation, because if your argument is actually, one about need or choice, or actually about working conditions. I mean, that's the thing beneath everything I was saying, wasn't it? That sense of, we're working in atrocious conditions as, low-paid farm workers. They weren't talking about big, well-organized agriculture. They were talking about, people on the margins, possibly migrant workers, et cetera, et cetera. So, the counterfactual of, well, what if the evidence had gone differently, sort of makes you think, but that probably wasn't, the main driver there. It was, how could it be that people are having to work in conditions? But the focus became risk. That was the thing that everyone was talking about, is it was purely a matter of weighing up relative risks. But you could say that's the tip of the iceberg. That's the bit that you see. But underneath that, there are a lot of assumptions. And to answer your question, then somehow there is that idea that if you want to make a good argument, particularly, when you're confronted with scientists in an advisory committee or whatever, simply saying this isn't fair, we don't like this, our members shouldn't be exposed to these kind of working conditions, isn't going to have much bite with an advisory group. What are they supposed to do about that? These are independent scientists. They're not representatives of the farming industry. So that's really interesting how people, it seems that, in order to make, in that kind of context, what is they perceive as a valid argument, they use the language of science.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because what you see in interactions between people who disagree, that people construct arguments in order to persuade others, and while doing that, they will construct arguments of which they think that the opponent finds them important. So there is a lot of contagious behavior in that. So when I think that you find numbers and figures very important, and in our culture we do, then people tend to construct their arguments with the help of numbers and figures. Whereas it's a little bit weird, because people don't think in numbers or figures or statistics. They think in stories, and we immediately make stories out of them. But somewhere, somehow, when we construct arguments, we do that because we think others find that important and convincing.
Well, except maybe for the physicist.
What would you say as a physicist?
As a physicist, one of the things that is happening also in the first story is that it seems to be all about one number. The statistical evidence in one measure of something being good or bad, and we've already seen that you cannot really tell good from bad unless you set a criterion for yourself, which is completely subjective. Okay? For example, in my field, we say something is evidence, and it's the so-called 5 sigma evidence, if the probability that it would be random is less than something like 1.4 times 10 to the minus 7. And if this is a too scientific number, it's very small. It's sort of much better than 1 in a million. But we set a scale, but it's arbitrary. And in other parts of science, people set scales at 3 sigma, and then you get to like 0.1%. There's even sciences which puts the limit at 1 sigma. Then you know that in 33% of the cases you're wrong. But still, in more than half the cases you're right. So that is based on an agreement, okay? And it's already very difficult to reach that agreement before you do an experiment or before you look at your data. And basically, even among scientists, it becomes impossible to agree on the limit after you looked at the data. Mm-hmm. And in the public debate,
why is
normally
that?
it's, well, because one party finds a 2.6 sigma effect and they say, well, we should really set it at 2.5 sigma because then we found something.
Because then it fits.
Right, because then it fits my hypothesis.
Exactly.
Then we can get a grant.
And well, yeah, money drives. But in the public debate, it's no different. Okay, you look at the numbers and you say, well, this is convincing. And say, well, why is it convincing? Well, yeah, and then comes some argument, but it's always after looking at the data. Mm-hmm. And then things tend to go horribly wrong, both in science and in society, I'm afraid.
And I was talking about beyond all reasonable doubt. But if that's the level of beyond all reasonable doubt, what you call the 5th sigma, then, you're never going to get that in a case of this sort. It's always going to be a weaker sense of balance, I suppose, or trade-offs or comparisons. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
I can imagine that sort of way of treating the evidence well, by not looking at the data before agreeing on what do we actually count as evidence beyond all doubt. It doesn't work like that in public debate because you don't have this moment before looking at the evidence because the evidence forms the basis of the debate in the first place. Yeah. I can imagine that not working.
Well, in this case, for example, in having the questionnaire, if they would have set together the committee and the workers and agreed on a set of questions, that would already have been one thing. Mm-hmm. If they then also would have agreed on, okay, what do we call sort of, well, maybe not conclusive evidence, but at least some indication, okay. Now, of course, in that case, one of the parties would have been wrong if you set a sharp criterion like that. And then immediately after that, they would have contested that it was the wrong limit and the wrong questions anyway. Somehow the debate seems to me then less blurred.
Mm-hmm. But I can imagine, I mean, what you are talking about is about the phenomenon of joint fact-finding, that people together decide what facts do we need now here to make reasonable decisions. But I think I have the impression in this debate, there was already a sort of distrust, probably, so there is a sort of damage in the relation, which then asks for a different kind of... I mean, then that's exactly that people within their own community, and that's what we see in COVID, and we see it everywhere, that they are constructing their own evidence, so to speak, and then it's used as a sort of weapon in the debates. So that's a different situation, and it's hard. Well, it's hard to find to come to the point that people, opponents, together decide upon what facts do we need now to prove what. That's the challenge, I think.
But I think out of those sort of stories, like the one I was telling about, 245T has definitely been reflection. It was also in that document, the one, the Sapir thing about making sense of science. A reflection on, well, what do you do in these situations where there are so many uncertainties? And, and certainly one recurrent lesson has been about transparency, that, for the advisory committee, and they did actually publish their findings.
They need to be transparent about there being so many uncertainties.
Yes,
Yep.
yes, particularly about that fact. What's the reasonable thing to do? And COVID, of course, was like this all the way through. I mean, there were so many uncertainties at so many levels. Justifiably so. That's the way it is. That's the way it happens with these things. But to be transparent, and that's back to this trust issue as well, because that means bringing farm workers or parents or just general members of society into the discussion. And it is very interesting when you look at COVID, and I don't know the story in the Netherlands, but I was very attentive to the way it was being handled in Denmark and in the UK, the two countries I know best. I would say in Denmark there was at least in the initial stage, a much greater willingness to say, we're doing the best we can. These are the fundamental uncertainties. Whereas in the UK, and other people have experience, particularly of the Netherlands, it was more rule-based. Do not do this, do not travel. We were talking about it before, this distance from your home. Whereas in Denmark, it was more, this is the situation. We are very nervous about this thing. We're not going to patrol your private life. You have to be reasonable. The police are not going to come into a private party. That's not what the police are here for. But please, that's a fundamental thing, and that's back to this question of democracy. So for the advisory committee in the first story, it's a shame that the meeting became so very acrimonious, because I've talked to both parties, because I think there was some sense, I definitely heard farm workers leaders saying, well, but the arguments of the scientists, they are decent people, they're trying. And certainly some sympathy with the farm workers from the advisory committee. But when it becomes, as you were saying, Noelle, frozen into a conflict, it's really hard to make those opening up concessions.
Yeah, and I can also imagine that what you said about trying to create trust by being open and by being transparent.
Yeah.
I can imagine, though, that there could also be a situation in which if there isn't already trust in you as an advisory committee or as a policymaker, then being open about it can also have the opposite effect of people thinking, well, they don't know what they're doing either. Why should I follow whatever they advise me to do?
Yes, that's totally correct. Yep. I always think if students could see how we mark their assignments, would that make them more trusting of our marking or would they think, what?
Well,
he's doing it how late at night? Did he have a drink before he just, so there's, no, of course not. But,
of course not.
Of course, yeah, just the transparency would justifiably open up questions of that. So it's not in itself an endpoint. But without that sense of, either I'm sharing information with you, or for good reasons, because sometimes it is like that. I can't share this information with you, but here's why I can't share this information with you. Then it's really very difficult to. But now we see we're getting a long way from just the statistical evidence. We're talking a lot about the conditions in which statistical evidence can be used in the best way possible.
But maybe we should also be transparent about the statistics themselves. Because statistical evidence is in some sense never conclusive, like we just said, okay? Like in this case, to get to the 5 sigma level, I just calculated you would need 10 to the 13 people to be exposed. And you just...
It doesn't seem like a good idea.
That's much more than the world population, so it's rather impractical.
And how many would have to die to...
yeah, a fair fraction. No, so clearly, but to be transparent in the numbers, that also, if you claim a certain number there, and usually one claims an average, you also have to say that this comes with an uncertainty, and the margin of uncertainty then determines sort of how valuable the piece of evidence is. If there's an enormous margin of uncertainty, then basically weight goes down. If it's very well determined, then weight should go up. But I actually never heard in the public debate a number with an uncertainty quoted. Absolutely.
Would that work?
Because they are used for strategic reasons. So if you do that, then you undermine your own arguments.
Question, okay, what is your uncertainty on this number?
But I'm wondering whether that would work, because I can only speak for myself, but I have managed to avoid any statistics throughout my entire education, which I don't know what I think about that now, but what I mean to say is that statistics isn't a subject in elementary school, for example. So
that's horrible, because we should educate people to live with uncertainty from the start.
Fair.
In life, basically everything is what we call a stochastic. So it's everything is submitted to statistical distributions. There's very little things which are certain, maybe except for mathematics.
But we don't seem to teach that.
Statistics.
But we don't seem to teach that to people, at least not from a young age.
Which I find incomprehensible.
What would the world look like if we did
because
that?
it's true, statistics rule. So one big fact of life, and we just don't teach it. It's like.
So educating people on statistics, would that solve the problem of basically misusing?
Yeah, I don't mean like a sort of a detailed statistics, mathematical statistics, but at least educating people on the idea that many things are not just a number, but a number with an uncertainty. And the basic rules of how, in general, most of the uncertainties are approximately Gaussian. There's a jargon term,
I'm nodding,
okay? But most of them behave more or less the same. So if you understand that, okay, if you understand like if you're one uncertainty away, then you catch sort of 67% of the distribution, and 33% is in the tails. And if you go a little bit further out, and you go down to like 5% in the tails or 1%, or
it's like a spectrum of uncertainty.
Yeah. That idea, that basic idea, okay, will allow you to understand if somebody claims a number with an uncertainty.
How does that deal with the case of COVID, for example, where in the early days of COVID we knew something bad was out there, but I mean there simply wasn't by definition any statistical basis for deciding, for example, is it worth closing schools and keeping people home?
No. So it's not like measuring everything will actually make you be able to decide properly.
What would it entail? I mean, educating people from an early age so that they have at least a conception of an uncertainty principle.
Yeah. For example, the figure that the Danish minister showed.
Yes,
it's about two distributions, okay? And if you widen the distribution, the peak goes down.
Yes.
And it helps if you have a problem with peak load. And a single number there would not have told the story. You really need the concept of an average and spread.
I can't argue against people having a greater awareness of the uses of statistics. I think it fits with what I was saying about having an open discussion. But I would say there are other aspects of dealing with uncertainty which are not just statistical, but I mean this phenomenon. I picked a historical example in 2452. But with a strong sense that this resonates a lot with current experience too. So we're seeing this, and I think you could argue on the one hand that the existence of uncertainty comes as no surprise to any of us. I mean, we could go outside and it could be pouring with rain, and we're all going to get soaked. How do you know that's not going to happen? We know these things happen all the time. So that's a trivial example, but sometimes it's something more serious happens. A member of our family gets ill. Well, why? But the bit that's often missing in educational terms is this broader category of dealing with uncertainty and how we think about uncertainty, and that includes the psychological aspects and the ethical. So I would go with the statistics, But I would also want to say there are other questions which are kind of lurking there about, well, what are we supposed to do? Go back to that herbicide weed killer case. You know, how do we supposed to think about a thing like that? You know, do we take it one by one and say, what's the evidence of that? Do we take a portfolio? Do we ask questions like, you know, are there other methods of agriculture which avoid this? You know, how can we train people to deal with those really complex situations? Probably there isn't going to be a single answer that everyone agrees with, but the fact that we seem to keep stumbling into these questions and not learning, particularly from previous experience, that's got to be a social problem.
It was actually a question I had. You said that there was some extensive reflection in the report of the committee. So what was done with it?
Well, I mean, they continued. It's an old story. Basically, life moves on. You know, that gradually, this is often what happens in these situations.
To the drawer.
Yeah, the weed killer quietly gets withdrawn. It wasn't banned at that point, but you know, once you have enough controversy about something, then people start to find alternatives. That often is practically how these stories end. And you could say, hey, that's a reasonable compromise, but it doesn't seem like the best way of dealing with these situations. Because what if the chemicals that are brought in instead are more dangerous than the ones you've just faced out? Those are the fundamental uncertainties that keep coming up in these situations.
Then because we are so focused on the numbers involved in this particular case, those are questions that don't even come up, I imagine.
Yeah, it's. I mean, the way in which the union finished that was by saying, you know, we want a different way of doing this, which our voices are in, so to say. But for the scientists on the advisory committee, that challenged their role very much, because they didn't see themselves as a democratic body. They saw themselves as rigorously going through the evidence. So, I mean, there's been a lot of change, particularly after mad cow disease. I mean, people look at those issues a little differently now. But certainly, I mean, the fundamental division still remains.
So maybe that's part of it, is that a decision like that by a committee is presented as an absolute thing.
Yeah.
Whereas they could have said, well, I think that not banning it, that it not being harmful is more probable than it being harmful. And therefore, we take this decision. But it's like, by the way the decision is phrased, it's like there's some absoluteness in it.
As if there are no values involved, and that's of course the case.
This was also true, for example, with the COVID history in many countries, also in the Netherlands. Then they said with absolute certainty you must do this, this, and this. And then, of course, a year later they said, well, maybe you should do the opposite. But nobody told anybody that the recommendations they made, or even the rules they set, had some probability in them for being just wrong, because you always act on incomplete evidence.
If you're open about that, are people going to follow your rules?
Well, there's maybe the Denmark case is maybe interesting.
Yeah, but then, I mean, like with the citizen data scientists, you know, actually one of the problems, and I thought this might come up, is, well, then how do you sort out what I was calling the citizen data scientists from, let's just call them the cranks, you know, who are also, they are defined crank is not very sociological, sociological too. And you know,
People who maybe have fallen victim to a lot of misinformation.
who just were coming out with all sorts of stuff. Those people were there as well. Probably less in Denmark than you might find in the USA, for example, but they were certainly there too. So that filtering process, the ones we talked to generally had a sense of themselves as good citizens, you know, that they were doing and they did talk, as I showed you, about their own anxieties and trying to get some control and worrying about what was going on, and their way of dealing with that was to do some modeling. Obviously very skilled people. But they saw themselves as, because of course this is a country where people know each other by name. It's and the scientists would know, and they would talk about individual people who were tweeting, and so it was rather tight knit in that sense. This community of people who are listening. And of course, that's one, you might say, rather ideal condition.
There's also a lot of trust as well.
When you start from a kind of social consensus, really, around we expect to be treated as responsible people, and in return, that's an obligation on us to be responsible, which is kind of how it went from the Prime Minister. Of course, that's creating a sense of shared social collective responsibility for ourselves and for others, not the more individualistic thing that I might say was the pattern in the UK, putting that very simply, where if people weren't held to account and the police weren't checking what they did, they were likely to do all sorts of crazy stuff. Of course, things did go wrong in Denmark, the mink scandal, where many mink were culled, and it turned out that
Mink?
There was a big Denmark is a country with many mink farms, and there was an argument that mink were.
I thought it was a name.
No, it's not a no. It's an animal.
It's an animal.
Communicating.
Fur coat.
But that was very damaging because in that story, the government was seen to have gone beyond the law. Wasn't say it did the wrong thing, but it went ahead of what the legal advice would be. That was very damaging in terms of trust. That something could happen which was not in accordance with law. It was just taken for granted that that would be the case. So that's when the early, very good handling, I would say, became troubled because, are you really representing this in the correct way? Or are you breaking the rules, even though you're supposed to be? Once that's very corrosive for a sense of trust when you don't believe that people are acting in the way that they ought to.
Yeah. I see you nodding a lot, Noelle.
Of course, the UK and the Dutch government had a sour starting point in trust. For all sorts of reasons.
Yes, we're keeping off Brexit, but you mean around vaccines?
In the Dutch situation too. So there were all sorts of scandals piling up.
Well, just coming back maybe to this idea of educating people to understand or to read statistics. I'm just wondering. You were bringing up the last, conclusion on connecting to values and policies, these kind of things, and I'm just thinking of research of Imke de Boer, is a scientist from Wageningen, an animal scientist, and she did a study to different approaches to agriculture. How can we organize a sustainable agriculture for the future? And there were 3 scenarios. One is improving intensive agriculture, or trying to develop circular agriculture, or even biological.
Intensive agriculture being like big farms.
Upscaling, even more upscaling by means of innovation, technological innovation. And those 3 lines of thinking, they have been developed with the help of a lot of statistics, models, figures, numbers, etc. And they have been published in quite sky-high journals. So that's an interesting thing, but they are contradictory. So you can educate yourself in statistics, but you won't be able to have a constructive dialogue about it when you don't involve values then, because I think then statistics, they really fall short in order to decide what to do.
So how do you conclude they're contradictory?
Well, those 3 approaches, they are sort of excluding each other, you could say.
Right, so if
that's the way they are presented. This is the solution, or they are presented in terms of or.
But it wasn't exactly clear from the numbers that were used which one was the best.
No, they were not in that sense compared. But it's that people just use the statistics in order to promote a specific approach. So you can then, let's say, fight or discuss the statistics with what statistics are more true than the others. But do you think that's still useful then?
So the statistics hijack the discussion, basically.
Yeah, yes, that's what they do.
To pull this into scientific, okay? So if these conclusions had included an uncertainty, and if then sort of with large margin outside of these uncertainties, they would have been contradicting each other, then somebody, more likely everybody, would have made major mistakes. And then the research is flawed.
But you
So now it's taken as if the research is an absolute value. You have 3 results which are contradicting each other, and you say they are presented as all equally true. Well, they could be if they are sort of statistically inconclusive and overlapping in that sense. Or it could be that 1 or 2 or 3 are just wrong.
Yeah, but what I want to say is that they start from different values, and they start from different ideas of how how do we shape the future, and that should then be, I think, the point of discussion, and not which statistics are true or better than others.
No, of course, if you
that's what I
compare
mean.
3 incomparable
and that's what often
situations,
doesn't. Most of the time, people stay defending the numbers and the figures, etc.
But if you take the case I was using, the 245T case, you could say the farm workers and the advisory committee were looking at the same evidence. You know, the farm workers union had clever toxicologists, you know, and academics working with them as consultants who were compiling evidence. They were looking pretty much at the same evidence the advisory committee of pesticides were looking at, because that's all published, it's all out there, there's nothing secret, or generally not secret, but coming to radically different conclusions. You know, what one side would see was, well, significant uncertainties about whether there was a correlation. Others was saying, come on, we've got this study, this study, this study, this study, they're all suggesting it must be something. So again, I'm trying to support your argument. You know, the frames were very different, and then what you consider to be enough evidence will be very different. You know, back to this burden of proof argument as well. And if you're all thinking, well, we're just interested in this single weed killer, or you're thinking, but we have a responsibility for 100 weed killers, you're also going to be looking at this very, very differently. Yeah.
What I'm wondering now, like I've heard that that emotions play an important role in framing and in picking which statistics support your narrative, but also there is this point of people aren't basically not educated enough on how to think about statistics and how to think about uncertainty. So, which one do you think is the most crucial thing? Are people just not understanding how the numbers work, or is their understanding clouded by the way they want to interpret them?
Well, in these particular cases, I'm not sure. But if I connect it to another topic brought up, citizen science, then I think citizen science is clearly the case for better statistical education. Both in terms of people representing data and people drawing conclusions from representations of data. I think it sort of data in the wrong hands may be very harmful.
Then would you say, is going to play devil's advocate here for a bit, would you say that science is the sort of thing that should be democratized? Because we are not...
Well, you can ask that question, okay? And actually, in my field, we are asking ourselves this question because there's the call for open data, and then there's many people say, well, no, but if we put our data public, it's going to be handled by people that don't know what they're doing, and they will claim things, and they will connect our data to infamous claims, and we will discredit it, etc. Okay, so now, I think this is a temporary thing. Okay, we're losing this. You will go to open data. The data will be public. People will be looking at it. You will have to deal with it. So it's not a question of, I think hiding data, yeah, you can try for a while, but you cannot try forever. So you will have to deal with the fact that everybody can look at your data at some point. Willem is not agreeing, but I fear so. But that's not necessarily bad, because it has very good sides.
Yeah.
And the good sides will be more amplified if some significant body of people have some basic competences to look at it. That's the democratic effect. If the bulk of the people is unable to know what from what, okay, then you get all sorts of bubbles with all sorts of wrong conclusions. If the majority would be able to make sort of a corrective move, then you're in good shape. So it's about educating the bulk in some basics.
What do you think about educating the scientists? You know, because you could
so there's also
now we're getting into the discussion.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
because you could say, you know, the farm workers, you know, might think about that dossier, and perhaps they might have had more help with that. But the advisory committee also had a lot to learn. I think they did learn a lot, you know, and I think the more thoughtful of them, I'm sure some of them thought, they're just being emotional, you know, this is, you know, they're engaging in political tactics, this is kind of corrupting the sensible discussion. I'm sure some of them thought that. But I've spoken to many who said, you know, it made us think a lot about our responsibility and the way we're doing our jobs, and you know whether we're listening enough. And this thing about the recommended way and for the recommended purposes, you know, well, if people are telling you that isn't what actually happens in the recommended way, you know, is it then ethical to continue to say such a thing? You know, because you could say that that's a very dangerous thing. It's you know, if there's clear evidence that isn't what happens, then it doesn't seem a very responsible, I put it, you know, to the debate, position to take, to keep insisting it ought to be like that. Sometimes you just have to recognize, well, you know, the world isn't the way we might want it to be, and it's irresponsible to keep acting in that way.
So you would advocate trying to close this gap between the public and the scientists from both sides at the same time?
Yes,
sure. Yeah.
yes, and because the public is contextualizing immediately the figures, the numbers, etc. So, and they pose different kinds of questions. That's what Brian Wynne has perfectly, let's say, developed this idea. So, yeah, I think there should be a dialogue in order and explore assumptions, norms, values from both sides. Absolutely.
And you can see that happening in some places. I've actually I gave that example to advisory committee members, you know, 10 years or so later, and expected a conflict with them, and they said no, this is, you know, they wanted to hear. So you can certainly see people in these positions at least willing to debate, but the worry would be, I suppose, when, you know, precisely when advisory committee members, in this case, you know, try to stick too rigidly to their own worldview without acknowledging that there are legitimate other questions, and the line around that, around the statistical evidence or whatever, is not as firm as they might like to believe. I mean, I think then you get into this situation of apparently being more clear-cut than is reasonable to be, given the nature of the evidence.
I'd like to pose one more last question before opening the floor for you guys to ask questions. So, would you say, do we need to learn to use numbers in a better way? Or do we need to learn to focus less on numbers when we communicate with each other?
I mean, when people use numbers and also scientists, when they use numbers and figures in public debates, I mean, they don't talk so much about the numbers and the figures. I mean, you can talk about the temperature in this room, for instance. It could be 20, 21 degrees or whatsoever. That's not in itself very interesting to talk about. It becomes interesting when you add value to that, when you say it's too cold or it's too warm, and who is thinking what and why, and what should we do then? And this is what we are talking about most of the time when we use numbers to talk about other things. So I think about values, in fact. So I think we should try to become very explicit about values, norms, assumptions, fears, probably, because we very easily say, hey, we have the ratio and they have the emotions. And I think that's also very dangerous when you want to create distrust. Then you should say to the people, hey, you have the emotions and we have the ratio, because that's absolutely a wrong contradiction, I would say.
Yeah, so maybe also recognize that values are at play on both sides of the
Absolutely,
debate.
and emotions as well.
Okay, I think that's it.
I must admit that I'm very physicist-like. My mother says it's warm in the room. Okay, I'm going to look on the scale and say, no, it's 21 degrees. It's not warm. You just imagine that.
That's quite warm, 21.
Wow.
I mean,
But you can say, hey, yeah.
I'd say
I think a lot of it,
You should contextualize that.
now we are very much talking about values.
I think also, I mean, there is something very beneficial in knowing where the numbers come from and how the numbers are generated. I think, on that, just last time on that particular case, possibly, what is the basis of these, of the evidence? Well, that's animal data, it's epidemiological data, it's statistical extrapolations, from some kind of laboratory testing. So I think it's extremely helpful to have the numbers, but also to say, this is how we do this, and because often that's, fascinating people. Oh, so you're basically trying to, get figures like how many deaths are likely to follow on the basis of just that amount of evidence. That's what we got. This is how it happens. This is the kind of data, messy and untidy and unconvincing as it is, and that's very revelatory. So it's not just the statistic itself. It's
The
how
process
did
behind
you
it as
get
well.
that? What assumptions have been built into it? That's where I'll join you. As long as we can explain where the statistics come from and their basis, because sometimes people are very shocked to see that it's rather limited evidence and by definition circumstantial.